am going to be recording, so I can share a recording out with the registrants after our session. You'll get a follow-up email with a link to where you can find the recording and the slides. So hi, thank you for being with me this afternoon. I'm Erin Owens. I'm a professor in the Newton Grisham Library here at SHSU. I'm the scholarly communications librarian, and basically in that role, I assist faculty, staff, and students with a variety of topics related to conducting original research and then publishing or disseminating their research. So today we're going to be talking about drafting a data management plan. Now, this may be a familiar concept to some people. It may be a very new concept to some people. So I like to start out with just a quick thought about why it's important for us to have a plan. Anytime we're going to be conducting research that involves data collection, we really want to be sure we have a plan for how we're going to collect, store, describe, and potentially share that data. This is important for reasons like accuracy and efficiency, but it's also important for reasons like the longevity and reproducibility of our data. And in some cases, if we have received funding from certain kinds of organizations, especially federal agencies, it may actually be a requirement that we submit a data management plan. A quick word on data ethics. I'm not going to go really in depth on this section, but I think it is very, very important to emphasize that data ethics should underpin all of the planning that we're doing for collecting and managing our data. At the center really is just the core idea of do no harm. We want to be sure that we are thinking critically about what we're going to collect and why, what we're going to do with it, whether there could be any downstream harm, no matter how unintended, to populations that our data is about or related to. A couple of kind of principle sets to be aware of: the FAIR principles. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This is a set of principles that set some expectations for how our data is collected, documented, and shared in a way that is most useful to the research community at large, beyond just that one individual's use of their data when they collect it. The CARE principles set expectations for data governance by Indigenous peoples, which may or may not be related to your particular area of work, but it's a good thing to be aware of if your work will touch on those kinds of populations. So I've included links in the slides where you'll be able to dig a little bit more into FAIR and CARE if you're interested in those. And then I've also included a link here where you can delve a little deeper into some of the data ethics that come into play. As I said, that's just not going to be our focus today, but I want to be sure you have some resources there. So let's talk about data management plans, or DMPs, as you will often hear them called. Different funders and organizations might have different templates for exactly what a DMP looks like, what sections it's divided into, things like that. But in general, any DMP is going to try to answer 5 major questions. We want to be addressing what type or types of data will be produced, how our data will be organized, and what standards will be used for documentation and metadata, what steps will be taken to protect privacy, security, confidentiality, intellectual property, or other rights like this, how, where, and when the data may be shared or accessed, if others will have access to it eventually, and then where the data will be archived and preserved. That may be in a spot that is not publicly accessible, but where and how it will be archived and preserved, and for how long. So those are really the key questions we want to think about today as we go through some of the key sections of a DMP and think about our own research. Now, common DMPs may be divided into sections like this. Again, a specific funding agency may specify different section headings in their template, but If you don't have a template from a particular funding agency, this is a very good outline you can follow for just a general DMP. So we're going to talk about each of these bulleted sections. It's also important to note that if you are a sole researcher, you'll approach this in one way and it will be fairly straightforward. You'll be responsible for all of these steps as the sole researcher. However, if you are working with collaborators in a team context, whichever individuals are responsible for each of these steps should be clearly identified in your plan. So there should be someone who is held accountable that if we say it will be archived and preserved like this, which member of the team is accountable for making sure we actually do what we said we were going to do? Okay, I am going to be referencing a sample plan occasionally as we go through each section. So I just kind of wanted to familiarize you with this in advance. And I apologize. I meant to have this link already copied. Copy link. Okay, I'm going to place this into the Zoom chat. So if you would like to take a look at that sample plan, it will be there for you to see. And again, it will be linked in the slides that we'll share after the session. So this sample plan that I'll be referencing, its brief description, it's a study that lays out a plan to analyze play testing in video game development. Please note this is not necessarily a perfect model of the best possible plan that could ever be written. This is just a convenient example to kind of take things out of the abstract and help you see a concrete way that this can come together. All right. So let's talk about the first section in our DMP, the data description. The primary things we want to include in this section is briefly stating what data will be collected. And this can be kind of a 30,000 foot overview. So I've got some examples here. You might say, okay, I'm going to be producing one Excel spreadsheet of measurements of whatever phenomenon it is I'm measuring. I might be producing 10 interview transcripts in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word, or this folder of 100 fMRI images. So kind of just giving a really brief overview of encapsulating what are the major products being created with this data collection. You may need to address what the scope and the scale of the data is. This might involve kind of volume and quantity. So if I'm anticipating survey responses or measurements in a spreadsheet, how many rows approximately am I expecting? Doesn't have to be exact, but we want a ballpark. Is this going to be a, multi-gigabyte file that has thousands or millions of observations in it? Or is this going to be a much smaller file? You may also want to indicate the chronological or geographical scope of your data, if that is relevant to your context. And then potentially also the level of data, again, when appropriate, indicating what files will have raw data, and then to what extent the raw data will also result in products of de-identified, aggregated, etc. The data description should briefly address who you expect the audience of the data to be. The reason for that is that this helps to shape what specific variables we collect, how we format and describe those variables. So we're demonstrating that we are collecting data in a way that is compatible with what the expected audience would expect, compatible maybe with the way that data is typically collected on this topic or in our field. And this sort of goes to that interoperable piece of the FAIR principles. If everybody else collects things with variables X, Y, Z, and I go collect A, B, C in a totally different way, then we can't really compare that data in a useful way or combine it for some sort of an interoperable purpose. So clarifying that audience up front helps us to make sure those other aspects of the plan fall into line. And then finally, on a similar note, our data description might want to indicate whether there is other existing data that's relevant to what I'm collecting. Again, to help us decide what kind of variables and things we need to collect. This might influence where we archive our data, because if there's already other data sets that are related, we may want to co-locate these for archival or for sharing. I'm gonna give you just a minute or two to kind of think about these points in relationship to your own work. Maybe kind of jot down some notes about what your project would look like, um, what sorts of details you would include in this section for your project. I'll take just a minute or two. All right, so hopefully that gave you a moment to kind of start thinking about how your own work might fit into this section of the plan. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next section, formats. So the question here is, what sorts of formats would you use for submission, distribution, or preservation of your data? And the real key we want to focus on here is longevity and usability of our files. And to that end, we want to focus on formats that are platform independent and non-proprietary. So I've included some examples here. If we're going to be creating a spreadsheet, when we go to preserve or distribute that spreadsheet, we probably want to save it as a .csv file instead of an Excel file. That way the file itself is more accessible to users, not only right now, but when we think about down the road. If this data is being preserved, well, if it's an old format file of Excel, I don't know if any of you have gone back lately and tried to open any Microsoft Office files you saved in the early 90s, but sometimes it can be a little tricky. So we do want to think about our data as something that has a lifespan longer than just right now while I'm writing up my results. So some other examples, text documents, you're probably going to want to save them as .txt files or PDFs rather than Word documents or Google Docs. And for videos, MP4 is going to be a more independent and non-proprietary format compared to something like QuickTime that may only play on certain kinds of platforms or devices. So I'll give you just a brief moment to kind of think about what sorts of software you work in or what kinds of equipment you use that maybe create files in their own proprietary formats, and think about whether you know a good alternative that you could convert them to, whether you maybe need to find out, hey, I know my program produces these files. Let me research whether these are platform independent or whether I'm going to need to convert these to another format. So I'm going to give you just a second to think about that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the metadata section. Um, this section kind of is really very important. It's also not as intimidating as it might sound at first. Metadata is sort of a big fancy jargony term. Essentially, if you think about your data set. Let's just assume it's a spreadsheet for the moment. You've got a spreadsheet with your data. The metadata for that spreadsheet would be things like, what is the title? Who is the creator? What date was it created or shared? So it's really just those kinds of key details about a file, much like you would have a citation for an article, right? The key with metadata is just that it's usually written in some structured format. But beyond seeing and copying that structured format, the pieces of information are really very straightforward. So the question we're trying to answer here is what information would be needed for this data to be read, interpreted, and understood correctly in the future? So understanding things like when was it created? That's going to be important if someone looks at it in the future and wants to know whether it is still timely and relevant to a research topic. So kind of the basic minimum level here. You want to be sure you at least include the basic details that help to find this file or to even understand what this file is. Title, creation date, creator, if there are conditions for accessing it. Like maybe the metadata says, I'm not publicly sharing this data, but you can go here to request access under certain circumstances, something like that. Or maybe the metadata says, this data set will be openly available on this website until such and such date when it's deaccessioned. So the conditions of access may look very different, but you just kind of want to indicate that if someone stumbled across this description of a data set that had been collected, how would they be able to know whether they could get to it and how they might do so? Now that's the minimum level. Recommended, really we would recommend that you do that minimum level plus also documenting definitions of the variables that you've collected in your data, definitions of any kinds of standardized vocabularies that you've used, units of measurement that you used for each variable. If you've done qualitative research that involved coding, you would want definitions of what those codes are. And then, of course, the formats, file types of any files that are included in this data set. And then optionally, you could go even one step further. You could detail in your metadata some things about the methodology that was used to collect the data, any kind of analytical or procedural information or assumptions you've made, anything like that that would help the discoverer of this data in the future to have more context for understanding it. So that's kind of an optional level. Minimum, we're going to aim for that middle recommended. So let's dig into that just a little bit further. So the first thing we have to decide is what metadata standards will be used. And when I say standards, really what I mean is what structured format. We know all metadata is going to have somewhere to stick a title, somewhere to stick a creation date. But which structure are we going to use to define exactly how we enter those pieces of information? One very basic domain agnostic kind of option is Dublin Core. Dublin Core is very easy to understand. It's very easy to implement. So if you don't already know of some other metadata standard that your field uses, Dublin Core is a great place to start. I've included a screenshot here. This shows the elements or the pieces of information about your data set that Dublin Core would want you to document. The title, the creator, the subject, and they define sort of what they're looking for in each of these fields. And then I've got a screenshot here of what this would actually look like when you create your metadata. So this is just in a text file, right? Basic notepad.txt file. And it shows you the structure. So for the title, they enter it as dc.title and a colon, and then you put the title of your data set. So it's really just about understanding what those little structured headings look like, the little field names. But we can see in this example, the title, it's a United States Congressional Roll Call voting records from 1789 to 1998. We can see the creators. There are 2 rows here for creators. So some of these fields you can enter multiple times when it's appropriate. We can see dc.description, gives us a little paragraph about what is covered in these roll call voting records. And then we can see dc.subject, and there's numerous rows there for different subject terms that describe this data set. That's where controlled vocabulary might come in. Depending on your field, there may be some vocabulary that says, this is exactly the standardized way that we're all going to refer to this event or this person or this concept. And you may use that vocabulary in those subject fields. Okay, so that's a little bit of an example there of what Dublin Core would look like. As I said, that's a good basic one that's kind of usable in any discipline. There are other options for metadata formats that are more specific to disciplines. And so I've included a link here that you can explore later if you're interested to see if there's anything in the standards catalog that is more common in a certain discipline. Okay, a little bit more here about metadata. So we want to be sure in our data management plan, we want to address a question of how are we going to be capturing and creating this metadata, this basic just details about our data set, and any other kinds of documentation like the definitions of our variables, the meanings of our codes and coding, things like that. So we might indicate that we're going to create a data dictionary. That's normally the term used for listing each variable that we're going to collect and how we have defined that variable. And that can be important, right? Because the way that I collect a certain variable might differ from how someone else has collected it in a different project. Even if it's something as simple as we use different units of measurement, that would need to be clarified in my definition of my variable so that someone could understand that they would need to convert it to a different unit to compare it with another data set. So we may describe that we're going to create a data dictionary for all of our variables. And here is a screenshot with just a very simple example of a data dictionary. We've got each of our variable names, the units of measurement, a little bit of details. If there are only certain values allowed in a field, you kind of define, like, what are the boundaries? What is it acceptable to enter in this field? And then a bit of a description and definition of that. Code books are the other kind of documentation that you may commonly create. Again, any kind of data, I typically think of it in terms of qualitative, but we may have codes in quant as well, where it's easier to represent a complex value with a digit or a simpler value to help prevent human error in many cases. And so here's an example. This is taken from the Carnegie classification data set, the system that's used to categorize universities. Like when we hear R1, that's Carnegie classification. So this is out of their code book. When they give a university a particular classification, they put it in a field called basic 2021 or basic whatever year of the data set. They actually assign the code. So a university will be assigned a code from 0 to 33. This code book tells us what those codes mean. So Sam Houston State University happens to be a 16. But if that's all I find is a spreadsheet that tells me Sam Houston is 16, that isn't meaningful. I can't interpret that. I need this code book as the translating tool in the middle to tell me that 16 means a doctoral university with high research activity. So definitely if we need things like a data dictionary or a code book, we're going to want to discuss that in our data management plan, talk about kind of how and when those will get created to accompany our data set. A README file is the other thing you will commonly encounter. This is usually a very, very basic text file, something that could be opened in Notepad, Word, any sort of software that reads text files. And it gives some very, very basic information. This is very similar to the kinds of stuff we would put in our metadata standards, like in a Dublin Core format. It's just very, very human readable instead of being a very structured, more machine readable format. This is the human readable version of that. So if someone finds your zip file with your data sets and all of this documentation, if they see a file that says readme.txt, that's their starting point. That's like the readme first before you try to dig into all these other files. And it's going to give them this very user-friendly summary of what the heck this data set and collection of files actually is. All right, so one last note I want to share here on the metadata section. Consider using, if it's appropriate to your discipline, consider using common data elements as part of your variables. These are essentially standardized question and answer sets that are already created to enable systematic use across studies. This can help us to ensure consistency. So if you think about a question where you might ask a participant for their race or ethnicity, asking them for their biological sex or their gender identity, these kinds of questions, there would be different ways that you could phrase the question and different sets of answer options that you could provide. The common data elements is going to recommend a way to phrase that question and to phrase the answer options, with the hope that then those questions are more easily compared across studies. So something to look at. This does come out of health. So some of the data elements they have are going to be very, very health specific, but particularly human demographic variables. I think this can be useful in any kind of field where you're working with human subjects. And then I've also got some links here for standardized vocabulary, thinking about like those subject fields in our Dublin Core metadata. Your field may not have a standardized vocabulary, and that's okay. But I've linked to a few here, and there are guides to find others so that you know you're using the same words that the discipline uses elsewhere to describe the same concepts. So here's a quick glance at our sample plan, right? This was studying playtesting in video game development. So they've kind of included this data description format and metadata all kind of smooshed together in one section. But they explain about the fact that the data they're going to collect is going to take the form of field notes, interview notes, audio recordings, survey responses. So they're collecting data in multiple different channels. And they talk a little bit here about quantity. So between 50 to 75 interviews in total. They're going to be transcribing them and then deleting them from the device. You know, they kind of go through these details, how the survey responses are going to be collected, and then what they're going to do with metadata. Metadata will be applied to all interview data, indicating the date of the interview, the roles, responsibilities, demographics of the subject. So they kind of give you some of this detail about what they're collecting, what this is going to look like, and how it's going to be documented. All right. So jumping into our next document session here, ethics, privacy, and confidentiality. The core question we want to be addressing here is things like, how is informed consent handled if our research involves human subjects, and how is privacy protected? So we need to be able to stop and evaluate the sensitivity of the data we're collecting, even if we may not be collecting it directly from human subjects. If it involves human subjects in some way, or groups or populations, we want to just determine whether it contains any direct or indirect identifiers, anything that could possibly be combined with other public information to inadvertently identify research participants. And we want to make sure we're taking steps to protect that privacy through anonymizing data. So most of us, if you've done human research before and you've gone through IRB applications, right, and gotten that human research approval, you'll have a better sense of what this section is going to entail. And it'll be very, very similar to kind of talking about the same steps you would describe in your IRB application for how you're going to protect privacy and confidentiality and minimize potential harm. So we want to think at this stage too, if we're going to be creating informed consent forms for our participants, we want to think about whether there are any provisions we want to include there. If we want to let them know, hey, we're planning to share de-identified results, results that have been de-identified this way to protect your privacy, but be aware that that will be shared, things like that. So thinking through what we want to make transparent to our participants. And then I've included a link here if you want to dive deeper into this area. This is a really great resource on specifically protecting sensitive data in academic research. All right, intellectual property. There's a couple of different questions here. Our first question is, will any pre-existing copyrighted materials be used in your work? So are you studying images that have been created by somebody else? Are you going to be referencing significant lengths of text written by someone else, etc.? If so, we need to understand how permission could be obtained to use things if we feel like it goes beyond what would normally be fair use for research purposes. Not only to use it, but then if I need to be able to share part of this data set after I'm done, how would I obtain permission to disseminate this pre-existing data? We also need to ask questions, though, about when we think about archival and preservation. If I hand over my data set to another entity to be archived, will any permissions that I've obtained already be transferable to them? Or will there be different permissions that we need to get for that archival? So that's kind of copyrighted material going into our work. There's also then the question of copyright coming out of our work. Who will own the rights to data and information that is produced by our project? This is where it's really important to know the institutional policies regarding individual versus institutional copyright control. I'm not going to dive into depth on SHSU policies. We do have some policies now about ownership of copyrighted material. I think my bullet here that says it's in process, this bullet's probably a little outdated. There was very recently a new policy approved on ownership of copyrighted material that you would want to look at to get a better understanding of exactly what your work entails and where there may be some element like commercialization, patent, something like that, that may cross over into an area of institutional control. Now, when we think about who owns the rights to data coming out of our project, one sort of odd detail to understand is that just raw data, just assembling measurement numbers in spreadsheet cells, is not technically copyrightable by itself. But a specific expression of the data that you've collected, like a bar graph or a line graph or something, some very particular way of showing or expressing that data could be copyrightable. So it gets into a tiny bit of a gray area trying to decide what you actually control out of the data set, as opposed to we kind of know what we control when we write up our findings. It is good to notice, though, also that in cases where your raw data maybe isn't subject to copyright, you can use licensing as a mechanism to control who can access it and how they can use it. So licensing is sort of this alternative option rather than just sharing it openly and saying, well, you're going to have to follow copyright. Instead, you keep the data more restricted and have people sign a license before you give them access to it. And that way, the license is a legal agreement between you about how they can use it. Now, that's kind of one side of the coin if you want to or need to control your data much more strictly. The other side of the coin is if you have data that you want to be sharing very openly, you want to promote other people using your data, you have the option to make it available under different kinds of Creative Commons licenses. These are also, again, licenses, kind of a legal agreement that's lays on top of copyright. But whereas a lot of licenses limit what you can do, Creative Commons licenses expand what you can do. So you can set different criteria about whether the data can be used for non-commercial purposes only, things like that. And you even have this option of a CC0 declaration, which would say, I remove all restrictions. Whatever my copyright protects for me, I am proactively saying that I'm not going to protect that and that I'm inviting people to reuse my data however they see fit without needing to come and ask me for permission. All right, so getting into our last few sections here, talk a little bit about storage and backup. We want to think about where and how we will store our data to ensure its safety. Um, Something like an SHSU, networked drive, cloud storage, someplace with frequent automatic backups happening or version history, those are going to be better than something like a USB drive, right? Something with a little more protection built in. How will the data be managed during the project? Part of what we want to think about here is version control and file naming conventions. So if you're going to be producing a lot of files, you know, 75 interviews or 1,000 fMRI images or something, you want to be sure you have planned out in advance. How am I going to create the names of those files so that I can tell them apart and so that someone else looking at this data set could go to the appropriate file without just trying to fumble around and open all 1,000 of them? Programs like Microsoft Office 365 do include some default versioning. That is very helpful. You still might want to also come up with your own system of downloading backups on a set schedule and identifying the versions in those backups so that you could store those somewhere separately as a really like emergency backup copy. And this is an example of what your file naming convention might look like. Now, it's going to depend on your data and which pieces of information are most important to identify a particular file. But this is just an example where the file name would include the year, the month, the ID number of the interview participant, coding to indicate that this is the file where I'm actually coding that interview transcript, not just the raw transcript itself. And then the little V2 to indicate that this is the second version that I've saved. We kind of already addressed this earlier in the format section. We want to save stuff to the greatest extent possible in non-proprietary open formats just to ensure longevity. Okay, so here we have our sample plan kind of touching on data storage and backups. They describe how they will be storing their data digitally and in hard copy. Talking about storing copies of their digital Evernote journal in 3 different places, how they will transport their hard copy field notebooks, indicating that they plan to retain their data indefinitely. The physical notebooks will be moved securely from place to place. The Evernote journal will be exported monthly as an XML file and stored on an encrypted hard drive. So you can kind of see the details they've thought through about having multiple copies for safety, but also how will you ensure that the files in a particular place are secured against inappropriate access by someone that's not part of the project. Okay, access and sharing. Some funders, this is getting more common at the federal level with, for example, the NIH in particular. Some funders will require that you be able to share some level of your data. Doesn't mean 100% of every data product at the raw data level, nothing like that, but they want there to be some component that could be shared, or else a very strong justification for why nothing can be shared. So we really need to stop and think critically about, from that data description section at the beginning, what are all the different levels and types of data that I'm collecting? How private is each one? And to what extent could I share, maybe I can't share the raw data. Maybe I could share the de-identified data or the aggregated data. So kind of thinking through whether there is anything that I can share and then like what specific levels that's going to fall out to and what conditions or restrictions I might need to put on certain pieces of it. And we don't have to treat every piece of that data set the same way. If I've got transcripts and images and this and that, they don't all have to be, one size fits all. I can treat each piece differently as is appropriate to whatever its content is. So then we want to be sure that our plan addresses how, when, and where will you share the data? Why did you choose that particular method of sharing it? And what terms of use do you have, if any? It's really important to note that historically, a lot of authors simply state in their article that the data is available upon request. But there have been some studies done in recent years that have shown that it's really not. The problems of people's contact information in an article going stale over time if they've moved on to another institution, or researchers that may have passed away, data sets that may have been misplaced, deleted, lost, forgotten about. So I think that's really why it's important to think in our plan, why are we choosing this method? Really explaining to ourselves that it's appropriate. So that saying, well, I'm going to share it by indicating that someone can email me. Let me think through why I'm doing that. Is that really going to be sufficient? So taking a look at our sample plan here on data dissemination and access, they talk a little bit about here about how they will ensure the confidentiality for their interview participants, and then what they will be sharing. Now, in this case, they talk mostly about sharing their results in presentations, publications, as opposed to actually sharing data set files. This might be very appropriate for some contexts. This might not cut it for NIH when they're saying, no, no, writing it up in an article isn't enough. We actually want to see you share some data files. Oh, I did forget they have this second section. So here they do also say that their de-identified data will be made available in the qualitative data repository at Syracuse University. They specify when, within 3 years after the grant ends. They've already confirmed with that data repository that the data is suitable for archival. The data repository has already agreed to take responsibility for maintaining these things in archival, etc. So they've laid out this whole plan. We know exactly where this is going and who's going to take care of it. All right, so archival, that brings us to kind of this last section here, thinking about archiving and preservation, which can be a little different than sharing. Even if there's something we can't share publicly, we may still want it archived and preserved in a restricted location, so that it would be available in extenuating circumstances if someone really needed it for appropriate reasons. So we could talk about long-term archival. Maybe that is just saving it on my local hard drive, or maybe that's giving it to a dedicated data repository. Are there any costs involved in preparing the data and documentation, getting it into the right format and status to be preserved? Am I just sort of managing that at each step as I go, which would probably be more efficient? Or am I going to hire somebody after I'm done with my project and have them create all this documentation and make sure everything is preservation ready? Do I need to take into account any costs if I'm going to give my data to be hosted in a repository? If so, is there something I can do at the beginning of the project to write those preservation costs into my budget? So there's a lot of good reasons why we don't want to wait until the project is done to think about the preservation aspect. And then a final kind of question that may seem odd sometimes, but based on the data you're collecting and its likely, useful lifetime, is there any point in the future where you foresee that the data would need to stop being archived and preserved or be destroyed entirely? And if so, when and how? That may not apply to all data. There may be cases where you say, this data could be useful forever. It can just sit there. But there may be cases where we really do want to think about, if this becomes outdated enough, is there some potential for harm that we want to clean up after? Okay, specific funder requirements, just touch on this real fast. As I said, some funders do require very specific formats for your DMPs. This is an example here of the sections required by NSF Bio grants. So when you're preparing a DMP to go with a specific funding application, be sure you reference their exact requirements. It's just like what we tell our students about following instructions on their assignments. If NSF Bio tells you to prepare your DMP like this and you do it differently, who knows? They may just reject your application out of hand because you didn't follow the instructions. So we always want to make sure we're referencing their guidelines. There is a very cool free tool that can help you with this called DMP Tool. You can log in with your SHSU user credentials. This system provides funder-specific templates with all the sections you need to fill in, but it also has guiding prompts from both the funding agency and the DMP tool itself. They'll give you prompts that will assist you in addressing each section. The software also allows you to collaborate on plans with co-researchers. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot of what it looks like when you're writing a plan. It will tell you you're going to fill out this section on the data and materials produced, and then it gives you a description of what it's looking for. Describe the types of data, physical samples, etc. And then you have this guidance pane over on the right that will give you guidance for both DMP tool and NSF to help you go a little further in understanding what is going to be appropriate in that section. All right, so with that, I've included a few additional resources here in the slides that you can reference after the session. And I am putting my information here on the last slide as well. You are welcome to reach out to me with questions at any time. Assisting with going through things like the data management planning process, this is part of what I do. So I am always here if you would like to discuss it. And with that, I'm going to open it up if you have any questions for me right now. Feel free to use the chat, but also feel free to unmute and just talk to us.
Thank you, Erin, for all the resources. It was really helpful.
All right, you're welcome. Well, great. No questions right now. That is totally fine. Reach out to me if any questions come up later. And as I said, you'll get a follow-up email in about an hour that will have a link to where you'll be able to find the slides in the recording. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time this afternoon.
No, thank you so much for the presentation.
Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.